The Galactic Council killed a human girl. Earth didn't respond, it erased them entirely. The Galactic Council killed a human girl on a Tuesday. Not metaphorically. Not collaterally. They voted on it. 40 seconds. Done. Her name was Mira Osei. She was 26 years old. She had 17 languages in her head and a pen she clicked 3 times before every translation session. She wore the same blue jacket to every council session because she said it made her feel professionally invincible. She was wrong about that, in the end. I was sitting 4 rows behind her when it happened. My name is Colin Asante. I had been Earth's diplomatic liaison to the Galactic Council for 11 years. I had watched 341 sessions from that same chair. I had seen border disputes settled in under an hour. I had seen civilizations argue over moon rights for 6 sessions in a row. I had seen a Tier 3 species representative fall asleep mid-testimony and nobody bothered to wake him because the testimony was about grain tariffs. I had never seen anyone die at the table. Until Mira. She was not supposed to speak that day. Her role was documentation. She sat behind the main delegation, transcribed proceedings, and flagged translation errors for review. That was the job. That was what 26-year-olds with 17 languages did at the Galactic Council. They documented. They waited. They worked their way up slowly, like everyone else. Except Mira had caught something in the morning session that I had missed. The Council was ratifying the Outer Frontier Expansion Zone, a standard territorial document. 1,400 pages. Nobody reads 1,400 pages in real time. That is what junior staff are for. Mira had been reading it since the session opened, 3 colors of pen going, blue for inconsistencies, red for deliberate ambiguities, green for errors the other side did not know they had made. The zone as drawn overlapped 3 inhabited microworlds. Small populations. Pre-contact civilizations. Not council members. Not anyone's trade partners. Just 3 small groups of living beings sitting inside a boundary line that, once ratified, would authorize full resource extraction through their home systems. Mira raised her hand. She was not recognized. She raised it again. The session continued. She stood up. The chamber did not stop. The administrator, a tall figure in the gray uniform of Council Procedural Authority, looked at her the way you look at a notification you plan to dismiss. She spoke anyway. She identified the error. She cited the page numbers. She gave coordinates. She was precise, clear, and correct. The administrator called a procedural vote. Not on the expansion zone. On Mira. Unauthorized disruption by non-seat species representative. Procedural violation, Section 7, Clause C. I stood up. I was recognized. I started to speak. The vote passed before I finished my first sentence. The enforcement mechanism is not something I will describe in detail. I will say only that it was fast, that it was built into the chamber infrastructure, and that it was over in under 10 seconds. The council had designed it that way. Not out of mercy. Out of efficiency. The chamber resumed. The next agenda item was a catering dispute between 2 civilizations over nutritional supplement supply rights to 3 jointly operated space stations. I sat back down. I looked at Myra's chair. She had left her pen on the armrest. The clicking pen. Blue. There were small marks on the armrest where she had tapped it during long sessions. I counted them without meaning to. 17. The administrator slid a document across to me an hour later. Formal notification of incident. Standard diplomatic paperwork. He said, in the universal trade tongue, that Earth was welcome to submit a grievance through official channels. The review cycle was 400 standard council periods. 52 years. He said it the way you say the weather. I took the document. I folded it in half. I put it in my jacket pocket. I did not file it. I went back to the human quarters on the station and sat in the small kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked at the wall. I thought about how I was going to call George Osei, Myra's father, a man who built telescopes for a living because his daughter had once said she wanted to see everything. I thought about what words exist for this. I could not find any that fit. I called him anyway. He picked up on the second ring. He was in his workshop. I could hear something metal being adjusted in the background. I told him. I used plain words because there are no good ones. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. He asked if she had been right. About the error. About the three worlds. I told him yes. He said he knew. Then he said he had to go back to work. I said okay. I held the phone after the call ended. The coffee was completely cold. Outside the station windows, the council's home system turned slowly, vast and lit and completely indifferent to the fact that a girl with 17 languages had just been taken out of the world for the crime of being correct. I submitted my resignation in the elevator going down. I did not hold a press conference. I did not announce it to anyone. I typed it on my personal console and sent it before the doors opened at the ground floor. 11 years of diplomatic work, filed and closed in the time it takes an elevator to descend 4 floors. The doors opened. I walked out. I did not look back at the chamber. Not because I was not angry. Because I was already thinking about something else. Something that would take much longer than anger. Something that, once started, would not stop. I had 11 years of council data in my head. Trade routes. Supply chains. Dependency nodes. Infrastructure contracts. The 17 species Earth had been quietly embedded with commercially for decades. Not as a major partner. Nothing so visible. As the kind of partner you do not notice until something stops working. I thought about that all the way to the transport bay. I thought about it on the ship back to Earth. I was still thinking about it when the shuttle entered the atmosphere and the clouds broke below me and the continent came into view, green and enormous and carrying, as it always did, the quiet weight of everything humanity had ever survived. We had survived a lot. The council did not know that yet. Earth said nothing. That was the part that confused everyone. Within 48 hours of my return, the council's diplomatic monitoring network had logged the incident, categorized it, and was waiting for the standard response cycle. A minor species had 3 options: a formal protest, a request for expedited grievance review, or an emergency petition to the neutral arbitration court. Earth sent none of these. Earth went quiet. Council news channels filled the silence with their own conclusions. Most of them agreed on the same one. Humanity had been reminded of its place. A small, young, emotionally volatile species had learned, the hard way, that the council's procedures were not suggestions. It was unfortunate. It was also, they said, clarifying. Sometimes a species needed a boundary moment. This was one. They called it a boundary moment. I read those reports in my hotel room in Accra. I read them the way you read a document you plan to use in court someday. Carefully. Without expression. I went to see George Osei 3 days after I landed. I had been to his home once before, years ago, at a function Mira had organized for the diplomatic team. I remembered the house as warm, a little cluttered, full of the smell of metal and oil from the workshop. Telescopes in various states of assembly. Star charts on the wall. A photograph of Mira at age 9, standing in a field somewhere, pointing at the sky. He opened the door before I knocked. He had seen me from the workshop window, he said. He offered tea. I accepted. We sat in the kitchen. He did not ask about the council's procedures or the vote count or what I had said in the chamber before they stopped me. He asked about Myra's last morning. What she had eaten for breakfast. Whether she had seemed happy. I told him she had been annotating the expansion zone document since 6 in the morning. She had flagged the error at 6:42. She had been right about all 3 worlds. I told him she had been excited about it, the way she always was when she found something in the margins that everyone else had missed. He nodded. He looked at his tea. He said she was born finding things in the margins. We did not talk for a while after that. The workshop smelled the same as I remembered. Outside the window, his current project sat on the work table, a reflector scope he was building for a school in the city. He went back to it eventually. I watched him work for a few minutes before I left. His hands were completely steady. I thought about that the whole drive back. The UN emergency session convened 4 days after I returned. Closed doors, full membership, no press access. I was not invited. I watched the public-facing feed from my hotel room, which showed nothing except the closed doors and a time counter ticking upward. 12 hours and 40 minutes. When the Secretary General, a woman named Patricia Odom, walked out, she did not hold a press conference. She walked to her car. A reporter called out a question. She paused for half a second, just long enough to be readable, and then she kept walking. Her face said nothing dramatic. It said careful. The kind of careful that means you are carrying something that cannot be put down. I called my contact in the UN infrastructure office the next morning. He did not answer. He texted me 2 words. Not yet. I understood. I spent the next 3 weeks going through 11 years of council trade data. Everything I had observed, documented, and archived during my time as liaison. Every supply agreement, every component dependency, every infrastructure arrangement between Earth's commercial sector and the 17 council-aligned species we had been embedded with. Most people thought of Earth as a junior trade partner to those species. Minor. Supplementary. Replaceable. I had spent 11 years watching the supply chains operate. I knew better. We were not replaceable. We were not even visible, exactly. We were structural. We were the specific gauge of bolt that holds a particular joint in a bridge, the one that nobody photographs because it is inside the wall. Invisible until the day the wall comes apart. I built a map of it. 40 pages of connection diagrams. Every node where human origin components, human licensed technology, or human operated logistics touched a council species critical infrastructure. The map was not dramatic to look at. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like a very complicated plumbing diagram. That was the point. I sent it to Patricia Odom's office with a cover note 3 sentences long. 2 days later, I was in Geneva. The office was a converted floor in a building near the old UN complex. It had no sign on the door. It had no name on the internal directory. It had 7 people in it and a coffee machine that had been brought from somewhere else because the building's default machine was, apparently, a point of serious contention. Owen Hale was the economist. 40 years old. He had the kind of brain that saw numbers as geography, landscapes with peaks and valleys, and he had been mapping the Vethkai trade corridor for personal interest since before any of this happened. He was already 3 steps into the analysis when I arrived. Clara Ben had spent 8 years with international financial monitoring bodies. Her specialty was what she called invisible leverage, the kind of economic dependency that only becomes visible when it stops working. She had identified 3 structural collapse points in the Vethkai supply chain before lunch on my first day. The others came in that week. Felix, the network theorist. Nadia, the xenobiologist who had spent 6 years cataloging biological dependencies in alien agricultural imports. Priya, the data archaeologist. Leon, who had worked in trade compliance for 20 years and had the specific, useful skill of knowing exactly where every regulation had a gap. We never named ourselves. Naming things gives them edges. We did not want edges. We wanted depth. Patricia Odom came to the office once. She sat down, listened to Owen's summary for 40 minutes, asked 2 questions, and then said 4 words before she left. Do not go fast. That was the strategy. That was the entire strategy. Not a declaration. Not a fleet mobilization. Not a sanctions package announced to applause in a General Assembly. Those things have edges. Those things give the other side something to point at, something to respond to, something to build a counterargument around. We were not going to give them any of that. The council was expecting a military posture. Or a legal challenge. Or, at minimum, some kind of public statement they could log, categorize, and wait out. They had a 400-period grievance review timeline specifically designed to absorb exactly that kind of response. File it. Date stamp it. Leave it to age in an administrative queue until the species that filed it either gave up or ceased to exist. We were not filing anything. The Vethkai situation began 2 months after the Geneva office opened. The Vethkai were a mid-tier council species, 11 inhabited systems, 2 of them economically significant. Their protein synthesis operations ran on a refrigeration and transport infrastructure built, component by component, through a contract series that originated with a human manufacturer in Cape Town 17 years earlier. The manufacturer had long since been absorbed into a larger logistics company. The contract had been renewed 7 times. Nobody at the Vethkai end had looked at the origin documentation in a decade. Why would they? It worked. Then the components started arriving late. Not dramatically late. Not crisis late. 3 days here. A week there. Each shipment accompanied by a perfectly documented customs compliance error requiring additional human-side certification. Each certification request filed on time, processed correctly, routed through the appropriate channels. Just slowly. Just with a thoroughness that was, per the terms of the original contract, entirely within the human party's operational rights. The Vethkai Trade Office sent an inquiry. A polite one. They received a response the same day. A detailed explanation of the current certification backlog, a revised delivery schedule, and a formal apology for the inconvenience. The response was signed by a junior logistics coordinator named Owen Hale. His title on the letterhead was Supply Chain Compliance Officer. He had spent 4 hours writing that letter. He brought it to the office and read the best parts aloud. Clara made tea to celebrate. Leon said nothing but smiled, which was, for Leon, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The Vethkai sent a follow-up inquiry. We sent another form. I sat at my desk in Geneva and looked out the window at the street below. Traffic. A market stall selling fruit. 2 children arguing about something that looked very important to them. Normal things. The things that exist because people like Mira went to rooms like the council chamber and pointed at the errors that everyone else had missed. My phone had 17 unread messages from various council diplomatic monitoring accounts. I read none of them. I was not a diplomat anymore. I was something the council did not have a category for. That was exactly right. The Vethkai ambassador sent a formal diplomatic protest 6 months into the delays. 3 pages, carefully written, citing 7 clauses of the standard trade agreement. It used phrases like contractual bad faith and deliberate interference with established commerce. I passed it to Owen. Owen passed it to Clara. Clara sent back a response. 4 paragraphs. Polite. Technically airtight. Every delay explained. Every certification requirement justified by chapter and verse of the exact regulations the Vethkai Trade Office had signed off on during the original contract renewal. At the bottom, Clara included a small note informing the Vethkai Trade Office that due to recent administrative restructuring, all future certification requests would now need to be routed through a new compliance portal. The portal would be live in approximately 90 days. The Vethkai protest was not answered in kind. It was answered with paperwork. This was not something the Vethkai had been trained to handle. Their diplomatic machinery was built for 2 kinds of responses, confrontation and negotiation. Confrontation meant you mobilized and made a counter-threat. Negotiation meant you sat at a table and traded concessions. What was happening with the human logistics company fit neither category. It was a slow, perfectly legal, thoroughly documented friction that was costing them real money without giving them anything to fight. Their ambassador escalated to the council. The council assigned it to the Economic Disputes Subcommittee. The subcommittee scheduled a review in 8 months. I received a quiet, private message from a council analyst I had known for 6 years. She worked in strategic assessment. Her message contained 1 sentence. She said, "Colin, we know it is you." I did not respond. She was right, but she was also wrong in the way that matters most. It was not just me. It was Owen and Clara and Felix and Nadia and Leon and Priya and the 53 other people who had been quietly brought into the network over the previous year. Policy analysts. Trade lawyers. Logistics engineers. A mathematician in Nairobi named Victor Ease who had been building predictive collapse models for alien infrastructure as a personal project for 3 years and who had, upon being contacted by Priya, simply said, "I was wondering when you would call." It was Patricia Odom reading briefings at midnight and asking exactly the right question every single time. It was a cargo ship captain named Gilbert Okafor who rerouted his runs through non-council systems 6 months before we asked him to, because he had done his own reading after Mira died and reached his own conclusions. It was dozens of people who, without coordination, had started doing the same thing. Looking at the map of where Earth touched the council's infrastructure, and thinking carefully about what happened when that touch was withdrawn. That was the thing about humans and grief. We do not process it the same way twice. Some of us cry. Some of us go quiet. Some of us build things. Some of us take very detailed notes and start drawing connection diagrams that look like plumbing but are something much more permanent. 3 months into the subcommittee review, I found something I had not been looking for. I was going back through the original expansion zone document. The 1,400-page ratification that Mira had been reading the morning she died. I had obtained a full archive copy through the Neutral Arbitration Court's public record system. I went through it the way Mira had, methodically, 3 colors of pen, looking for everything she had flagged and everything she might have flagged next. On page 912, in a secondary appendix, there was a revision note dated 3 weeks after Myra's death. The boundary line for the outer frontier expansion zone had been adjusted. Quietly. Without announcement. Without any public record of why. 3 microworlds that had previously been inside the extraction boundary were now outside it. A technical footnote described the change as a survey correction. No credit. No acknowledgement. No mention of the human junior staff member who had stood up in the chamber and cited the exact page numbers and coordinates while they were voting on what to do with her. She had been right. They had known she was right. They had implemented her correction 1 month after they ended her life. I sat with that for a long time. I printed the page. I put it in a folder. On the folder I wrote 3 words, "She was right." I put it on my desk where I could see it every day. The Council's first internal report on what it was calling human trade irregularities was produced in month 15. I obtained a partial copy through channels I will not specify. The report's summary cataloged delays, compliance friction, and rerouting patterns across 9 human commercial relationships with Council species. It noted the pattern was systematic but could produce no evidence of a coordinated directive. The last paragraph of the summary was the one I read 3 times. It said, "The nature and origin of these disruptions does not match any known hostile posture. No military buildup has been detected. No formal grievance has been lodged. No public statement of intent has been issued. We are currently unable to classify this as a threat response." Unable to classify. That was the point. We had spent 18 months building something that had no category in their threat models. Every framework the Council had was built on one assumption: a species responded to injury with either submission or confrontation. We had done neither. We had gone quiet and started doing something for which they had no name. Felix put it best one evening in the Geneva office when we were eating takeaway and reviewing the month's numbers. He said, "They keep looking for our weapons. They do not understand that what we are doing is not a weapon. A weapon is something you use and then put away. We are not using anything. We are simply not offering something. That is much harder to stop." He went back to his food. Nobody added anything to that. The report recommended a diplomatic outreach to Earth to clarify the nature of recent trade pattern shifts. The Council sent the request to the UN Diplomatic Office. The UN office acknowledged receipt. No response followed. The subcommittee rescheduled. We kept working. 2.5 years after Mira died, the first Council species asked to meet with us directly. Not the Vethkai. The Vethkai were still working through the subcommittee process, a situation that now involved 14 separate compliance reviews and a certification portal that had developed what Owen described, with visible satisfaction, as a minor but ongoing technical issue. It was the Solhari. The Solhari were a Tier 2 species with 22 inhabited systems and a significant presence in the Council's governing structure. They held 2 permanent seats on the Economic Commission. They had been Council members for 200 years. By every measure the Council used to rank such things, they were important. They requested a private meeting through a back channel, not official Council channels. The message went to Patricia Odom's office directly, routed through a Solhari trade representative who operated outside the formal diplomatic structure. The message was short. It said, "We would like to have a conversation that is not on the record." Patricia called me the morning she received it. She said, "What do we do?" I said, "We listen." We sent 3 people. Owen represented trade. A lawyer named Grace Abra represented commercial interests. I went as the person who had been in the chamber the day it started. We met on a neutral station sitting in unclaimed space between Council jurisdiction and the emerging non-Council trade corridor we had been building for 2 years. The Solhari sent 2 economic officials, not diplomats. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The Solhari did not apologize. I had not expected them to. What they did was more useful. They laid out, very precisely, the economic situation their species was facing. They were not in crisis. But they could see the direction clearly. Human commercial withdrawal had hit them at 3 supply points. One technology licensing agreement was in dispute. A joint research program that had been running for 6 years had quietly lost its human institutional partner. What they wanted to know, their senior official said, was very simple. Was this permanent? Owen looked at me. I looked at Grace. Grace looked at her notes for a moment. Then she looked up and gave them the truth. She said, that depends entirely on the council. The official was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I wrote down word for word that evening in my hotel room. He said, the vote on your representative was unanimous. I was not in the chamber that day, but I know the members who were. Some of them have expressed private concerns about the precedent. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this as an excuse. I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know that it was not as simple as it may have appeared. I thanked him. I wrote it down. I did not change anything we were doing. The second internal council report came at month 28. I received a full copy this time. The title included the phrase Coordinated Economic Withdrawal Strategy. The summary had grown from 4 pages to 11. The list of affected species had grown from 9 to 23. The report was classified at the highest level the council used for internal communications. It recommended 3 things: a direct diplomatic summit with Earth's government, a joint task force to assess the scope of human commercial withdrawal, and a preliminary review of procedural violation Section 7, Clause C. That third recommendation was the one that mattered. Reviewing the clause that had been used on Mira. The council was, for the first time in its history, looking back at what it had done. Not from conscience. From consequence. I called Owen that evening. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the third recommendation. He was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he said, "How do you feel about that?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Like it is not enough yet." He said, "No. Not yet." We kept working. The thing about withdrawing from an economic system is that the damage is not linear. It sits at minor disruption for a long time, and then it tips, and then everything that had been held in place by the thing you removed comes apart at once. The HFY protein synthesis network tipped in month 31. It was not a collapse. No beings went without food. The HFY had contingency systems. But the contingency systems were slower and more expensive, and when they activated them, they displaced 2 other supply chains, and those displacement effects spread through 3 connected systems, and suddenly the subcommittee reviewing trade irregularities was being asked to explain a regional supply problem that had, on paper, nothing to do with Earth at all. The Council Economic Commission convened an emergency session. It was the first emergency session they had called over anything other than a military situation in 40 years. Felix brought a cake to the office to mark the occasion. Leon said it was premature. Felix said Leon had no sense of occasion. They had this argument about once a month, on various subjects, and it always ended the same way. They both had the cake. The UN received a formal summit request from the Council Secretariat 1 week after the emergency session. Patricia Odom's response took 3 days. It accepted the summit in principle and specified 3 conditions. The summit would not be held on Council territory. The human delegation would not be restricted to credentialed diplomats. And the summit would be recorded in full by the Neutral Arbitration Court's archive system. The Council accepted all 3 conditions. The Council had not accepted external recording of diplomatic summits in 200 years. The fact that they accepted it now said more about their situation than any of the economic reports. The summit was held in month 34. Neutral station. Full court recording. I was not on the delegation. I had chosen that deliberately. My presence would have made the meeting about me personally, about the day I watched them vote on Mira and sat back down with nowhere to put it. I did not want that. I wanted the meeting to be about the math. The delegation was led by Nadia Ocon, who had left the Geneva team 6 months earlier to return to formal diplomatic training. She was 31 years old. She was precise and calm, and she had the specific quality of making very large statements in very quiet voices, which is a skill that is extremely difficult to learn and almost impossible to teach. The Council presented its economic concerns. Nadia listened to all of it. She took notes. She did not interrupt once. When they finished, she asked one question. She asked, was the vote on the human representative unanimously approved by the full Council membership? The Council's lead representative confirmed that it was. Nadia thanked him for the confirmation. Then she outlined Earth's position. She did not say Myra's name. She talked about what humans called accountability, and what it looked like from Earth's perspective when it was absent. She talked about the HFY provision, a proposal Earth had been preparing for 14 months, which would establish formal diplomatic protection for any accredited representative of any species operating within a council chamber, regardless of seat status. She laid the proposal on the table. The council asked for time to review it. Nadia said they could have 30 days. On the flight back from the summit, I got a message from Priya. In the 48 hours since the summit began, 3 more council-aligned species had made private inquiries to the non-council trade network that Earth and 16 other species had spent 2 years building. Not because they loved us. Because the math was moving. That was what power actually looks like when it changes hands. Not a battle. Not an announcement. Just a slow, quiet shift in where the numbers point. I put my phone down and looked out the window at the stars. I thought about a girl in a blue jacket. 17 languages. A pen that clicked 3 times. I fell asleep before we landed. I had not slept well in 34 months. That night it came without effort. I did not analyze that. I just let it happen. 7 years. That is how long it takes to change something that does not want to be changed. The neutral arbitration court accepted the case in year 4. It was not called a war crimes case. The court did not use that language. It was filed as a civil matter. Estate of Mira Ose, represented by Earth's legal delegation, versus the Galactic Council, on the grounds of unlawful termination and violation of fundamental diplomatic protections. The Council's legal team fought the filing for 11 months. Not because they expected to win on the merits. Because they understood what winning looked like for both sides. If Earth won, precedent was set. If the Council won, the economic withdrawal continued and they had a precedent of a different kind. That they could do what they had done and face no consequence at all. They fought the filing because they had no good options. Grace Abra led our legal team. She had been preparing the case for 3 years. Every document filed through the court's official record system. Every procedural step followed and logged. She wanted the council to see exactly how we were building it, because the visibility itself was part of the point. She wanted them to watch it coming. When the council finally ran out of procedural challenges and the case was formally accepted, Grace sent me a message that said, "We are in." 2 words. I forwarded it to Owen. He forwarded it to Clara. Clara forwarded it to Victor Ease in Nairobi. Victor sent back a single character. A period. That was enough. The case ran for 14 months. Court proceedings are a specific kind of patience, long stretches of technical argument punctuated by moments where something important is said and everyone in the room knows it and nobody raises their voice. Grace was extraordinary in those moments. She had a way of letting silence do the work after a key point was made, just enough silence that the room could feel the weight before anyone moved on. The council's defense rested on one argument. Procedural violation 7C was an established rule of council governance, applied consistently and within the council's jurisdictional authority. The rule existed. The rule had been enforced. Grace's response, when it was her turn, was short. She said, "The question before this court is not whether the rule existed. The question is whether the rule was compatible with the foundational principles of diplomatic engagement that the council's own founding charter claims to uphold." Then she put page 912 on the screen. The revision. The boundary adjustment. The 3 worlds. The date, 3 weeks after Mira died. She said, the representative the council eliminated was correct. The council implemented her correction without credit or acknowledgement 1 month later. This court is invited to consider what that tells us about what the council understood at the moment they voted. The chamber was very quiet. Grace did not add anything. She sat down. I was watching the live feed from the Geneva office. All 7 of the remaining core team were there. Owen had made coffee. Nobody was drinking it. We just watched the screen. The verdict came 6 weeks later. The court ruled against the council on 3 counts. Unlawful termination of a credentialed diplomatic representative. Failure to provide due process. And a new finding, the one that mattered most and would outlast everything else. The court established that representatives of any species, regardless of seat status, who were operating within a formally recognized diplomatic chamber were entitled to basic protections under the foundational principles of interspecies engagement law. The ruling was named, per the court's standard practice, after the originating case. The HFY provision. I read the name 3 times when the ruling appeared on my screen. Then I got up, walked to the window, and looked at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. Two men were laughing at something on a phone between them. A child was sitting on a step eating something and watching the street the way children watch things, completely present, completely unguarded. Normal life. The things that exist because somebody pointed at the error in the margin. I called George Osei. He picked up on the third ring. He was in the workshop. I could hear the metal sounds. I told him the name of the ruling. I said it slowly. He was quiet. Then he said, "Say it again." I said it again. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "Good. One word." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. His current project. A school in the eastern part of the city had asked him to build a portable telescope rig for their outdoor education program. He was enjoying the design problem. He asked if I was eating properly. I told him yes, which was approximately 60% true. Before I ended the call, he said, "Colin." I said, "Yes." He said, "She would have found something to fix in the verdict itself." I said, "I know." He said, "She was like that." I said, "Yes." We hung up. 3 months after the Osei provision ruling, the council formally presented its response. A package of reforms. A revision of procedural violation section 7 removing the enforcement mechanism. An acknowledgement, diplomatically phrased, of the circumstances surrounding Myra's case. And a formal invitation for Earth to return to full council participation. Earth accepted. Not immediately. Not with ceremony. 6 months after the ruling, a small human delegation filed its re-registration with the council secretariat through the standard administrative portal. No press release. No summit. No announcement. The delegation's junior documentation specialist, on her first day, sat down at the table in the observer section with a pen she clicked 3 times before she opened her notebook. Nobody had planned that. Some things are just the shape that things take. The memorial in Accra was finished in year 6. Not a monument. George Osei did not want a monument. He had been very clear about that when the city council proposed one. He said, she was a person, not a statue. What they built instead was a small garden in the district where she had grown up. A bench, a few trees, a path. The kind of place where you could sit and look at the sky without anything in the way. On the bench there was a small plaque. It said, Myra Osei. 17 languages. She was right. George had chosen those words himself. I was there when the garden opened. A Saturday morning, cloudy, the kind of light that turns everything soft. Approximately 40 people. Family, colleagues, people from the neighborhood who had known her as a child. Nobody made a speech. That had also been George's preference. People walked in and sat and stood and were simply there. I sat on the bench for a while. I looked at the sky. I thought about things I will not try to write down here because there are no words large enough for most of them. After a while I got up and found George near the edge of the garden, talking to 2 children who had come with someone from the neighborhood. He was showing them something on his phone. Probably a photograph of something astronomical. A nebula or a cluster. The kind of thing he had been showing children for 40 years because his daughter had once said she wanted to see everything. The children were looking at the phone with exactly the expression children get when they see something large for the first time. I did not interrupt. I walked back to the path and left the garden the way I had come in. I went to the council's home station for the last time 8 months later. Not as a delegate. Not as anything official. The council had a visitor access program now, part of the reform package, allowing representatives of any registered species to observe public sessions in the chamber gallery. I registered through the standard portal. I booked a transport pass. I went. The chamber was smaller than I remembered it, or maybe I had spent 7 years building it up in my head and the real thing could not compete with what memory had made of it. I sat in the gallery. The session in progress was a boundary dispute between 2 mid-tier species over mineral rights in a shared orbital system. Standard procedural content. The kind of session that could run for 3 hours and resolve in the last 5 minutes. There was a new procedure in place inside the chamber. When a non-seat species representative requested the floor during an open session, the chair was required to formally acknowledge the request within 60 seconds and provide a recognized speaking slot within the current session. The acknowledgement had to be logged by the court's recording system. A small thing. One procedural rule change among dozens in the reform package. It did not make headlines anywhere. It meant that nobody could do to anyone else what had been done to Mira. That was the whole point of it. I sat in the gallery and watched the session and thought about the first time I had walked into this chamber. 11 years of returning to this room. 341 sessions. Every long hour of listening to grain tariff disputes and orbital boundary arguments and catering complaints. I thought about a girl with 17 languages and a blue jacket. I thought about her pen on the armrest. I thought about the 17 marks she had made when she was bored. I thought about the fact that 3 worlds were intact because she had stood up. That the boundary line on page 912 had been moved because she had read it carefully and flagged it in green and stood up when she was not called on and said what she had found. And then I thought about something I had not let myself think about until that moment, sitting in the gallery of the room where it had happened, 7 years later, watching a routine session about mineral rights. I thought, was this enough? Not did we do enough. I knew what we had done. I had lived every day of it. The non-council trade network we had seeded now connected 41 species and operated independently of any single governing body. The OSE provision was galactic law. The reform package had changed 17 procedural rules. The council's jurisdiction had contracted by a third. The math had moved in permanent ways. I knew all of that. What I was asking was different. Was any of it the same as her being here? The answer was no. It was never going to be yes. That was the thing I had known since the elevator. Since I typed my resignation before the doors opened. Since I sat in George Ose's kitchen listening to the metal sounds from the workshop and watching his hands stay steady because they had nothing else to be. You do not do what we did because you expect it to balance anything. You cannot balance a life against a legal provision, no matter how well crafted the provision is. You cannot balance a life against 41 trade routes or 3 worlds with their boundaries intact or a bench with a plaque in a quiet garden in Accra. You do it because the alternative is watching a girl stand up and say something true and get voted down for it, and then going back to your desk and filing a grievance and waiting 52 years, and that is a kind of choice too. We chose a different answer. The session in the chamber ended. The chair called a recess. The room filled with movement and noise, the small busy sounds of a room that had been sitting quietly for hours releasing all at once. I sat still for one more moment. Then I got up. I walked out of the gallery and through the corridor and into the main transit area of the station. The same transit area I had walked through 11 years ago on my first day. Different faces, different species, different ships on the docking manifest. Someone bumped into me near the corridor junction. A young woman, moving fast, a bag over one shoulder, a document in her hand. She had ink on 3 of her fingers in different colors. She looked up when we bumped, said something apologetic, and kept moving without breaking stride. I watched her go. I did not say anything. Some moments do not need words. Some things you just carry with you down the corridor and out through the doors and all the way home, and you do not try to make them smaller than they are by wrapping language around them. I went home. People ask me sometimes if we won. I never answer that directly. Because the honest answer is, I do not know what winning looks like when what you wanted was for a girl to have lived. What I will say is this. They killed her like it was nothing. 40 seconds. A form number. The next agenda item. And we spent 7 years making sure the galaxy understood that there is no such thing as a human life that is nothing. We did not announce it. We did not declare it. We just demonstrated it, one day at a time, one careful move at a time, in a language the council had not been built to read until it was the only language left on the page. They did not know that about us. They do now. I think about her every day. I think about the 17 marks on the armrest. I count them when I cannot sleep, which is not as often as it used to be. I count them and I let the number sit there, and I think about a person who counted to 17. Who read to page 912. Who stood up when she was not supposed to and said something true in a room full of people who did not want to hear it. She was right. Mark that down.